The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. This is Mary Boo at the North American Council on Adoptable Children, and we're here to welcome you to our webinar this evening, Parents as Changemakers, Advocacy 101. And I am really excited to have you all here this evening. We at NACA have long been committed to the understanding that parents are amazing advocates. They have the information about what's really happening and the stories and the passion that can change minds and policies and rules, and as a result can make children's lives better. And I do want to just say, although this session is particularly for parents, we also would say to keep in mind that some of the best advocacy includes young people who've experienced foster care and adoption, and that's really the parent youth teams are powerful. So again, although we're talking about parents tonight, that it's good to keep in mind being teaming with others who are affected by life in foster care, adoption, and kinship care. I want to introduce my co-presenter tonight, Marissa Sanders, who does some consulting for NACAC and is also director of the West Virginia Foster Adoptive Kinship Parents Network.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and to have you all here joining us remotely. As Mary said, I do some consulting for NACAC, including these kinds of webinars, which I love doing, and I direct our state foster parent association, essentially. And before I did this work, I worked in disability rights, doing different types of advocacy for a lot of years. I will draw on some of that and some of my current and recent experience doing advocacy to share some stories and some suggestions for how to do advocacy tonight. And I agree with Mary. I actually came through the youth with disabilities movement. So anytime you can get youth and parents working together, I think that that's a really powerful strategy and a really, really important voice to make sure that we don't leave the youth out too. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you. I want to do just a quick logistics before we get started. Again, many of you have probably done just webinars like this, so you don't really need it, but we'll be here for about 90 minutes. If you have questions, we'll hang on. And we will have time for questions a couple times throughout, but if a question comes up as we're going, please just type it in the chat or the question box, and we'll get to it when we have a break. Or if it's something that we can respond to by typing while the other's talking, we can do that too. We are recording this webinar, and we'll share that recording with you. You'll get an email after the session, so with a link to the recording, and we'll also post it on the NACAC website if you want to share it with others. Your line will be muted throughout the webinar, but again, we'd love for you to participate and be as interactive as you can using the chat. And again, we'll keep an eye on that throughout the session. And then the final thing before we get started is we'd love to have your evaluation afterwards. It really helps us shape this webinar. This is one we've done, and we changed it after the last time. And if you give us feedback, we might change it again. So we really do love to hear from folks about what worked and what didn't, and if it was what you wanted, because we're doing this, we hope, to meet your needs. So I want to start this webinar tonight. It's about advocacy, and we hope you'll learn things that will help in whatever kind of advocacy you're doing. But we are presenting it tonight as part of the Children Need Amazing Parents, or CHAMPS campaign. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's a national campaign to ensure bright futures for kids in foster care by promoting the highest quality parenting. And NACAC is a part of it because we know how important it is for children to have the best possible care when they can't be with their birth parents. The campaign's a collaboration of many entities, including NACAC, the National Foster Parent Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, Christian Alliance for Orphans, Foster Club, Youth Law Center, Children's Defense Fund, and it's supported by many funders. And the goal of the campaign is really about changing the system and spurring policy reform at the state level, doing some of the advocacy we're talking about today. And the goal is really what policies are going to make quality foster parenting more possible, and how do we ensure that foster parents are equipped with the training and support they need to help children heal, grow, and flourish. To achieve those goals, CHAMPS has identified 6 policy priorities, and these are spelled out in with great information in the Champs Policy Playbook, which I highly recommend that you all take a look at if some of these issues are important to you. And it's available at fosteringchamps.org. I think it's also there's a link from the NACAC website, or we can send you a link directly. But the policy playbook promotes policies in these areas that are identified here on this screen to really help foster parents, best meet the needs of the children in their care. And that's about supporting relationships between birth and foster families, which we know is critically important. Most children do go home and should go home. Implementing data driven recruitment and retention practices, engaging foster parents in decision making, providing access to dedicated staff and peer support, prioritizing placement with kin and those related to the family, and then ensuring timely access to physical and mental health services. And in the playbook, you'll find research based policy recommendations, examples from various states that you can replicate or adapt. And we'll talk a little bit more about 2 of these policy priorities before we get started. And it's really to kind of, again, the advocacy we're talking about can be used for any issue. But these are issues that we have heard over and over again are hugely important to foster parents and adoptive parents and kinship caregivers. And we can give some examples of them, and that you can help maybe frame some of your advocacy thinking. So the first one is about engaging foster parents in decision making. And if you want, you could put in the chat, how many of you who were foster parents, how many think you've been properly engaged in decision making about the kids in your care? Um, you can type that in there if you want. But again, as people type, we know probably not as many people have been engaged as we'd like and as they'd like. It's certainly something that we hear from folks that they don't feel engaged in the process. And there's a reason that really matters. So that we've seen that research shows that foster parent involvement is linked to increased foster parent satisfaction and intent to continue fostering. And what that means is fewer transitions for children and more experienced parents doing better by children. And foster parents often cite lack of involvement in decision making as a reason for being dissatisfied and even quitting. So, what does that mean from an advocacy perspective? So, um, what it means is that there are some policy or practice changes that you could make that will make children's lives better and foster parents' lives better. First is including foster parent in team meetings. Policies should be clear that foster parents are essential members of the team of experts supporting the child and family, and practices should make that participation easy and accessible. Foster parents should have notification and follow up regarding court hearings. Federal law requires foster parents to be notified and to be provided an opportunity to be heard, but that doesn't always happen. So, state policy could be changed to reinforce that importance and to require caseworkers to help make that participation happen. The another way that foster parents could be engaged in decision making is through creating a parent advisory boards. A number of states have done that, and it's been really helpful for them. And then another policy could be training and guidance for caseworkers on what they have to share with foster parents. A lot of states have rules about what foster parents need to know about health and education, but that doesn't always happen. So perhaps you need a new policy or rule about providing better information for foster parents. And another advocacy area right now is to that people can consider as a foster care bill of rights. This is certainly something that many states have looked at as something that where foster parents can have an opportunity to get more engaged and be more engaged in the process. So that's one area where you might consider some advocacy. Another one of the CHAMPS policy priorities is providing timely access to trusted staff and peer support. And we know that foster parents commonly report that peer support is um, the most important thing that helps them be better able to care for the children in their care, and often influences their desire to continue fostering. It's learning from someone who has those parenting strategies, who's seen it and done it and been successful, is critically important. And we've seen research that backs that up, that support to foster parents is associated with improved retention and decreased placement failure. And that kind of support includes support from caseworkers, training, support during crises, and peer support, as we mentioned. So what are some of the policy recommendations that you might advocate for? One might be dedicated peer support workers. Some jurisdictions, like Clark County, contract with licensed and experienced foster parents to mentor new caregivers, prevent problems becoming crises, intervene when crises do occur. You could have dedicated agency caseworkers. We know that there are places where the child has a worker, of course, a case manager, but that the foster parent might have a different worker. So there's somebody who's particularly thinking about how they can support the foster parent to best meet the child's needs. The other thing policies and funding can help with is support groups, which can be incredibly important, as we all know. Telephone support, kinship navigator programs are all policy and funding recommendations you might advocate for. So one of the things I'm going to turn it over to Marissa in a moment. Again, this was just framing about some of the issues we might want to consider. But first, we want to do a poll for you. Find out what your sense of what advocacy is. So if you will just take a minute to click off the selection that you think most counts as advocacy. I'll give a couple minutes to do that. And then we'll show those results in just a couple of minutes, and then we'll get into the meat of the webinar. I'll give it just another minute. And I apologize, I didn't look at the questions earlier when I asked about engaging in people were engaged in decision making, and a couple people did note that they were not as engaged as they might have been, but of course it depended on the case. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll here and show you what we have. And so I am going to turn it over to Marissa to talk about these results and to move on to what is advocacy. I think you might be muted, Marissa.
Sorry, I was muted. Most people said all of the above, which is correct. And influencing a decision, I can actually see where that all three above that are ways of influencing a decision. So you're right as well. But all of these, attending a protest, writing a letter, making a call to an official, participating in your local parent group or association are all ways to influence decisions, to advocate for a policy change or a program or something that you're looking for to help your parents. And on the next slide, I can't see it. There it is. If you could just take a minute and think about a time when you made a request for something and you were nervous to make that request. Maybe it was something at work, maybe it was something at home with your family or something. There's something that you wanted and you knew that you needed to request this, but you were really kind of anxious and nervous about it, but you were successful in whatever it was you requested. So if you think about that, what was it that made your request successful? For me, some things that have made as a teenager, and I talked my parents into giving me the money that they would have spent on clothes and shampoo and things so I could buy whatever I wanted. And I was really anxious about it, but I spent all kinds of time figuring out all the ways that this was going to benefit me. It was going to teach me how to budget, and it was going to teach me how to manage my money and how to save and how to be frugal and all those different things. And that was how I presented it to them. So I did some research, I thought it through, I thought about what would be a selling point for my audience, which in that case was my parents, and then I was successful. So all of those things that you did that made you successful in your requests, that's advocacy. You're all successful advocates, you've all done it. And you've all certainly done advocacy just by virtue of becoming a foster or adoptive parent or even working in this field. You've had to go through things that have made you a successful advocate. So sometimes people feel kind of overwhelmed or scared by that word, but I want you to just know that it's not something, it doesn't have to be something big and scary because you do it on a pretty regular basis. So what is advocacy? Well, we've covered a few of those things. Your voice is important, and in many ways, advocacy can just be raising your voice or raising a collective voice about an issue. And you can make a big difference. But to do that, you have to advocate. And one big way we do that is with stories and sharing experiences. Those are really our best advocacy tools, because policymakers can't fix what they don't know, and they don't know about it if they don't hear about it from you. So we started the West Virginia Foster, Adoptive, and Kinship Parents Network a little over a year ago. And when I first started working as the director, we were in the middle of our legislative session, and they were working on a big bill that had to do with foster care. And I showed up at the Capitol, and I, had a small group of foster parents that I was working with, and I said, here's what we're seeing in real life as foster parents. And they all were like, we've never heard this perspective before. We've only ever heard from, people who work for the state or for private agencies or service providers. We're not used to really hearing from the people on the ground. So they didn't know what the issues we were facing were until we went and talked to them. And then once we did, they were really excited to hear from us. So we have to make sure that we're raising our voices in that. On the next slide, I was trying to advance, but it didn't work. When you are doing advocacy, it's really, really important that you can't do it by yourself. And even as an organization, one of the reasons that I started our Foster Parent Association was because I knew that I couldn't do advocacy by myself on issues related to foster parenting. And even with a small support group that I was a part of, maybe 10 families, I couldn't do advocacy with 10 families. To do statewide change, I really needed a critical mass of people. But also you really need partners and other organizations that can also help you out with that. And when you're doing advocacy, there's some different roles that can be played as in sort of the advocacy realm. And one way to look at those roles is to think of them as an advocate, an activist, or a strategist. And different people will kind of fall into different roles at different times sometimes. So what do those things mean? Advocates make up the army. So they are like your boots on the ground. Like I just said, we needed a critical mass. So you have to have that large number of people that are involved and participating. They are usually interested in and monitor several issues at once. So while I might focus on foster care or child welfare in general, I tend to be looking at education issues or other issues that are sort of tangentially related, but that I want to just be aware of. Budget, the state budget, issues related to poverty, things that impact child welfare in other ways. They provide the power in numbers, and they prove to policymakers that the community cares about the issue. A quick example of that, we had about 25 foster parents come to our Capitol at the beginning of legislative session. And 2 or 3 weeks later, when they were voting on our bill this year, several legislators made a point of saying right before they voted, foster parents took the time to come here and talk to us and tell us why this was important. And so I have to vote based on what they're telling me they need. So, really that number of having advocates really helps with that. And what do advocates do? So some examples of what they do: they represent the grassroots. They tend to participate in group events, like I was just talking about at the Capitol. They share their personal experiences, and Mary's going to talk some more about that at the end of our webinar. But that's really, really important. Those personal lived experiences are often what policymakers need to hear, sometimes aren't hearing, and what really can resonate with them. So activities that they tend to do: advocates write letters, they make phone calls, they respond to action alerts. A lot of times you'll get an email or see something on Facebook that says, call your legislator, call Congress and tell them. They respond to those things. And then they also recruit others to help. So they might share on their Facebook, or they might forward the email or talk to a friend and say, hey, I need you to call this person, so that you drum up those additional numbers. The next role that I mentioned was activists. And a lot of times some people feel uncomfortable with this part of advocacy, or they shy away from it, and that's okay, but there's other people who are more drawn to it, and there's a place for them. Activists are very passionate and action oriented. So think of the people who show up at a protest or a rally or a march. They're persistent and not intimidated. They keep the issue highly visible and immediate. So while a policymaker might hear from some personal stories and say, oh, okay, well, but we have this big other crisis right now, and so we'll deal with your issues later. The activists are like, no, you're going to deal with it right now. And they keep that, the focus on that issue. They don't care about the politics of the issue. They want the solution done now. They're not so worried about, oh, well, they have to fix that thing, and then or this group says this and that group says, they just want it done. They're very focused on wanting it fixed. And they tend, because that type of advocacy is not usually sustainable over the long term, they tend to kind of take action in spurts when things really need to happen right away. So the types of things that activists do, they put a spotlight on the issue. Like I said, they make it really front and center. They put pressure on policymakers to act and act now. They usually frame the issue as a crisis, and they use extreme measures when needed. So, think people who chain themselves to something or are willing to get arrested at the Capitol over a really important issue to them. So some of their activities, rallies and marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience. And an example of this in my experience last year, like I said, when we were first starting the network, they were about to pass a bill that we didn't think was a very good idea. And so a bunch of us actually partnered with our state social work chapter and rallied outside of the majority leader's office in the House. And, we made a bunch of noise. We demanded a meeting. We didn't get the meeting because she was really busy. I did meet with her later, but we did get a lot of press, and we did certainly show that the issue was important, that it was immediate, and that we expected our voices to be heard. So there was some success in that. No one got arrested or anything though. And then the third role is the strategist. So the strategist is a person or a couple people who know the existing laws, have a pretty strong handle on kind of the legal part of what you're working on, or the laws that you're advocating around. They understand the system. They know how the legislature or the executive branch agency or whoever, they know how they work. They have taken the time to build long-term relationships with the policymakers, either in that agency or in the legislature, or maybe both. So they are really aware of all the politics of the situation and kind of who their allies are and everything. They also have the ability to write legislation, to draft bills or amendments, and to write op-eds and other policy pieces. So they tend to have those skills. And then the things that they do, they develop the issue and the message, but they rely on advocates and activists for input and action. So they don't make decisions alone. It's not like the strategist is sort of this high up person who's making all the calls or calling all the shots. They really have to have because like I said, one person by themselves can't affect change. They have to have the activists and the advocates and kind of make sure that everyone's agreeing. So they're almost more like the coordinator or the conductor kind of. They work with the activists, they work with the advocates. A good example that I'll draw on is, like I said, I worked at Disability Rights for a long time. And there is an organization in the disability community called ADAPT. And what they do, they're activists. They are the people who will show up and protest in the streets. They will, chain themselves to a bus. In fact, they did. That's how they started, because they weren't accessible for people in wheelchairs. So as the strategist, if I'm the strategist on an issue, I might say to a policymaker, I really need you to hear what the advocates are telling you. You've had all these calls. I really need you to pay attention to that, because ADAPT is outside and they're ready to come up here and chain themselves and sit in your office. If we can come to some agreement, I can probably get them to wait. But if not, to be able to have that kind of coordination, or to say to ADAPT, that I think they're really listening, so don't make them mad right now, or now is the time to really show up. And then the strategists, they write the policy alerts. They spend a lot of time at the Capitol. They attend political events so that they're building those relationships, and then they negotiate and mediate, like I was just talking about, with policymakers, staff, advocates, and state agencies. So the important thing about this is that every role has value. You don't have to play every role, and no role is like above another or anything like that. And you may play different roles for different issues. So like I said, I'm usually a strategist on the state level for our child welfare issues. On education, I'm an advocate. I will happily call and send letters and send emails about education issues, but I'm not the expert on that. So I'm not a strategist there. On a national level, I will add my organization's name to a letter. I will make calls to Congress, but I'm not a strategist on the national level either. So every role and style is valuable. It just has to contribute to the outcome. We need to all respect all of our partners, and then coordinate those roles so that we don't miss any opportunities. And then we do have one more poll. I'd like to know kind of which role do you see yourself in most often, or what role do you think best fits you? So if you can pick one on this screen, and then we'll talk about it for a minute. And if you have any questions, feel free to type those in the chat, and we can try to answer those. Okay, so our answer, most of you feel like you're an advocate. We have some strategists in the group as well. That's awesome. And sometimes it is true, while it's not really a linear thing that you start out as an activist or an advocate and then you become a strategist, sometimes that does happen, that as you learn the ropes and become more passionate about an issue, you may become a strategist, but then you might end up as an advocate for other things. But just kind of having an idea of which role you think you fit in can be also helpful, so that's great. And are there any questions? So it'll take a second to check in. Okay, and then I will pass it off to Mary, who will start talking about the steps in advocacy.
Great. Thank you, Marissa. I think that's really helpful to have people thinking about the different roles as we talk about what the steps are. And we'll talk a little bit as we go through this about, of those roles we just talked about, where do they fit into each of these steps. But there's some general steps to doing advocacy, and overview them here and then go into a little more detail on each one. But first, you've got to identify the issue. What are you working on? And then what do you want to get out of it? A lot of people, stop at what the issue is, but we'll talk a little bit about you got to develop your ask as an advocate. And then next, you have to figure out where you need to advocate and to whom. You have to collect data to support your arguments. You want to identify further partners and gather support. You want to keep working on your recommendations and strategy, which again is tied, of course, very closely to your ask. And then you always want to circle back and see how you're doing and what you can do differently. And I think, just as Marissa was talking about, it's not always linear how you advance from one to the other. These steps aren't always linear. You may actually, be starting out. You might have collected data that leads you to an issue, and so again, they're not always a set order, but. So first we'll talk about developing the ask, and of course you have to have one. And as I said earlier, one of the things, sometimes people get stuck with the problem, and I think that sometimes that happens with activists, that they, something needs to change, but we're not quite sure what the solution is. And as as a successful advocate, you have to know what a solution is, or be willing to work toward figuring out what that solution is. And you really want to frame that ask from a child's point of view. You want to say, what would be different? What could be better? And so, for example, we go back to some of the examples from earlier. If you want more support for foster parents, you still want to phrase that about the child. Children deserve to have caregivers who have the skills and abilities to meet their needs. If you wanted more engagement in case planning, you might say children do better when their foster parents can share information about what's happening in their lives and what's working for them. So again, we're framing these things that are important to foster parents by how they affect the children, because that's really what we're all in it for. And I think another example is, people talk about a foster parent bill of rights, and I would say it's much better to call it a foster care bill of rights. Include the rights for the children and youth, and don't forget the birth parents too, all of the people involved in foster care. The next tip when you have an ask is have easily understood language. Avoid jargon, initials, insider phrases, all of those things that can really trip us up in any field. But I think child welfare has its own special affinity for some of those things. And Marissa and I were doing a training not so long ago, and one of their asks was an improvement in the Red Book. And we, of course, looked at each other like, do you know what the Red Book is? I don't know what the Red Book is. And we didn't know what they meant. And it was the information that was shared about a child with a new placement. But again, if they're talking to policymakers, they're not going to know what a Red Book is either, or most of them aren't. So you got to want to remember to keep your language at a level that is understood to the layperson. The next part of your ask is you want to have the audience in the issue. What would you want for a child you love? How can you make them feel strongly about it? And this is where your advocates and your storytellers may be in the best position to bring people in and make them care. And as I said a little bit earlier, you really want to be solutions focused. Your ask has to be about what you can do better, not just what's wrong. So strategists and advocates can work together to come up with, okay, what is the bill or what is the rule change that might make something different? And you don't always have to the answer, but you have to be advocating for a change to address the problem, and you need to come up with ideas that will get people started thinking about it. And again, this is one where strategists might take the lead on identifying the specific laws or rules that can bring you a solution, or it's something you're all working on together. So once you know what solution you're seeking, you've got to figure out where you're going to advocate. And it's a bit of a chicken or egg with the one before. You can't finalize your ask until you know whom you're asking, but you need to know your goals and your proposed solutions before you finalize where to advocate. And in many cases, this is the strategist who'll take the lead here with where to advocate, but everyone needs to be part of ensuring that you're choosing the right venue. And as an advocate or an activist, you need to make sure that you are thinking very clearly about who has the power to make a decision. For example, I'll tell a story of a NACAG had a funding cut from the state, from a state a number of years ago, and somebody was like, "I'm going to write a letter to President Obama," and I'm like, "That's great, but this was a state level decision, so we've got to advocate at the state level." If it's a court decision, got to go to the court. So you have to know who made the decisions or the policies that are affecting you that you're trying to change. So say you want to create a foster care advisory board. You want foster parents to be more engaged in decision making. If you're in a county run system, you might go to the county social services agency or your county board. If you're in a state run system, you might go to DHS or Department of Social Services or to the legislature. And I'd say one of the things you often want to start with the social service agency in general, even if they're not the one to make the change, because you want to find out, are they partnering with you? Will they help you with data? Will they, can they make a rule change so you don't even need legislation? And also, if they're opposed, you're going to find that out, and that can help you because, of course, legislatures often turn to the department for advice and guidance. Um, and sometimes you do need to go to the federal level. If funding is a huge issue in your state, often you may want to partner with others to go to Congress to get more federal funding dedicated for a particular purpose. And so, again, you need to look at where you're going. And then you also want to look at who is already working on your issue and whom are they talking to, because that can help you. If they've already got conversations started, say with a member of a committee, if it's an issue that, affects education or mental health, are there other organizations that have good relationships you can rely on? So those are important conversations to have. With others, and that can help you choose to advocate where they're already putting. And Marissa's going to talk more about partnering, but again, your partners can help shape which direction you turn when you're an advocate. The other thing that advocates really can do incredibly well is help with data collection. As we talked about, you want to bolster your arguments and your stories with data. And one of the best data sources is you and the other parents around you. So you can encourage the creation of surveys by your state agency or larger groups and make sure you and others fill them out. Another wonderful way to know what's really happening is through focus groups, where, again, people have the time to tell their stories and talk about what's happened to them. And so participating in those is a great opportunity as an advocate to make a difference in the world. And the best advocates volunteer to be heard in as many ways as they can, whether it's serving on an advisory committee or being part of a task force. It's a great way for you to gather data that you're going to use, but also to share the data that you have lived with others. The other thing you want to do is know your state data. You got to help compile data and how it compares to national data or data in nearby states, because that can be incredibly powerful in your advocacy to talk about, we have 30% of kids in this state in group care. The state next door only has 10%. We need to look at what they're doing differently and how that's making a difference for kids. And so we'll talk a little bit more later about how to use data. But again, as an advocate, you want to both generate data and compile data and be a part of making sure your data is heard. And I'm going to turn it to Marissa.
Thanks, Mary. So as Mary was talking, I was also thinking about partners and about different places that you advocate. Specifically right now, some of the advocacy that's happening around the current crisis that we're facing as a nation really brings actually some different avenues of advocacy. I've been working on a state level on questions like, you know, do we have ways to help families with food or funding or, you know, on the ground kinds of issues, but then also working with some national advocates on what do we need to ask Congress for to give money to the state or to give money to the families. So that's just kind of an example I was thinking of different places that we advocate and how real that is right now. And also in terms of identifying partners. So when you're thinking about your partners, as I mentioned earlier, there's strength in numbers and you can't do this alone, especially when it comes to legislative advocacy. I can't tell you how many times I've leaned on my partners, if only because I can't be in two places at once. And sometimes they're running 2 or 3 or 4 bills. This year we had about 5 related to child welfare, and they might be 2 of them happening in 2 different committees at the same time. So sometimes I needed to have somebody else in one that could listen and, you know, let me know what was going on. So think about who else is working on this. Who do you need to bring into your discussion? Think about who's working on it both in terms of your allies and who might take the opposite position as you. It's really important to kind of know who those people are and also to have a sense of, is there a way that we can compromise? Are there things that we can work on together, even if we don't agree on everything? So think about the usual and the unusual suspects. For me, obvious allies oftentimes are the child placing agencies in our state, sometimes the state agency, sometimes education organizations, not as typical or inside the box. I work a lot with our Child Abuse America chapter. I also work with some grassroots organizations, disability organizations, people who are outside of child welfare but still have a lot of things that overlap. And also sometimes you just really need, like our Center on Budget and Policy, really, really good lobbyists who just know the system and they know the players really well. And so every now and then, if I would need to talk to a legislator that I didn't have a strong relationship with or didn't really know their background, I might go talk to them and say, what can you tell me about this person? What's the best approach to use? Or what's the more time I spent at the Capitol, the more I learned kind of who, even way outside of my world, just had those good relationships or understood how to navigate a little differently than I might normally do. So also think about what emerging leaders you want to recognize, elevate, and engage. So again, your partners are also your advocates and your activists, and thinking about who in your army you want to make sure to bring along with you and help them learn the ropes and help them get more involved. Give to get, so make sure that when you're working with partners, you are helping them as much as they're helping you. So I might sometimes go to a meeting that wasn't necessarily going to impact me, but to be there to support someone or to listen to a bill for them so that they would do the same thing for me, or sometimes they had already done that. Think about your outreach efforts, making sure that you're reaching out to community organizations and other partners that you want to work with. And then think about that wide cross section of supporters. Like I said, the usual and unusual suspects. And then think about your recommendations. So think about, and you need to do this with your advocates and with, you can't, again, the strategists can't do this alone, but the advocates and kind of everyone think about who is this recommendation that we're making, who will it affect? Will it affect children? Will it affect foster parents, adoptive parents, the state? How will this, schools potentially, or others, agencies? Who will it affect and how much will it cost? Both think about, when you're thinking about the cost, think about how much will it cost to implement it, or how much will it cost if we don't implement it. So one of the things that came up this year was we did a foster parent and foster child's Bill of Rights. Unfortunately, we couldn't get it as a foster care Bill of Rights. I wanted that. We also got a rate increase for families, and we had to talk about what will this cost if we implement it? What's the dollar amount? Or a good example, actually a better example, was respite care was in our foster parent Bill of Rights. And the state was saying that that was going to cost like $2 million in new money because it was guaranteed 14 days of respite. And so I had to think and talk to legislators, and advocates had to talk to them about what's the cost? Okay, maybe it is $2 million, but what's the cost if we don't implement that? What's the cost in families who burn out? What's the cost in families who can't foster because they can't get the support that they need if, say, they travel for work or they need, they need respite for other reasons? in terms of training and onboarding new families, in terms of having to move kids and the collateral cost of the trauma that they may experience, what's that cost if we don't promise families some respite? So looking at both the cost to implement and if not implemented. There's a great logic model builder at childwelfare.gov, the toolkit, that link there. That will help you kind of put together, think through your issue, think of strategies, and put together some ways of presenting it. And then think about your SMART goals and make sure that you are always getting buy-in from advocates. But think about those goals as being, shoot, I'm going to forget what the S is. Specific, measurable, thank you. What's A? Thought I had this on the slide. Anyway, think about making sure that your goals are well thought out, they're time measurable and realistic and everything else. And then make sure you're always getting the buy-in. And the next slide. Oops. Okay, and then once you have gone through maybe part of your advocacy, or you've done a whole legislative session or worked on a project and you've gotten to some, reach some of your goals, make sure that you're evaluating your progress. Look at what you have accomplished and what you haven't accomplished. Celebrate your successes. Always make sure that you take time to celebrate and to share those successes, because that's what helps people want to continue to do it. And then look at recalibrating and tweaking your strategies and making sure that you sustain your efforts. Remember that systems change is a marathon, not a sprint, so don't give up. In West Virginia, our legislative session is 2 months every year, it's 60 days. So it's rare that you get a bill introduced and passed in one session. And so we always have to say, this could take a few years, think about it as a marathon. So any questions on those topics?
I have, well, if anyone has questions, please type them in the chat box and we will ask them. I was going to say, Marissa, one of the things that on the last slide you triggered for me is the celebrating the successes, tying that into sort of building relationships in a way. I know that when we have had some successful advocacy here in Minnesota at the state level, if we had key legislators who were our champions, we maybe gave them an award or recognized them. So we're celebrating it for ourselves too, but we're also celebrating them, and that helps build relationships and we give them a family picture with an award, and we've seen them up in their offices, and it's then another reminder. So I don't know if you have examples like that, but I think that's a really nice thing to do with some of those people who are your champions, whether they're in the state agency or the legislature or elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Celebrating success means both celebrating with your partners, but also thanking the people who helped make that success happen. And so one of the things we did this year, we haven't quite gotten to awards yet, but that's on our list of things to do. I certainly did thank you notes and other things like that, but we had about, like I said, about 25 foster parents come to the Capitol the second day of legislative session. And then on the last 2 days, we had, the last day I had about 10 families with their kids come to the Capitol. And at that point, we were still waiting for our big bill to finally pass, and it did, but not until 10:30 that night. But I had said to my members, even if they pass it and it's all done early in the day, having people there to thank legislators will be really important. So several of them brought thank you notes, or they brought other things to just make sure that we were both showing up at the beginning when we were asking for things and showing up at the end, to make sure that we were thanking them and showing them how important their efforts were. So that's always important. And I wanted to mention too, on the last slide at the end of the session, we'll talk about some tools and things, but one of those tools is a challenges and solutions document that we developed last year that just kind of outlined a lot of the challenges that we were facing as foster parents in the foster, adoptive, and kinship in the system, and then a corresponding solution for each of those. In evaluating our progress and celebrating our successes, I was able this year to go back through that. It's a 2-page document, and Mary's got a link on there at the end. I was able to go through that and highlight in red all of the things that we have accomplished in just 1 year. And so that not only became a really effective advocacy tool, that document, because it really helped legislators to see, like, here's the issues and here's what we can do about it. But it also helped me to show advocates and show legislators and everybody, hey, look what we've done. Look at all the progress that we've made. And then it also is sort of a roadmap for what's left. So any questions or?
We do have a question. Hope is asking how you know who your fellow advocates are and how do you make sure you're not reinventing the wheel? So I think it's a great question and one that we even talked about. So Marissa, if you want to go first, but I can say some things too.
Sure, that's a great question. So finding advocates, one way that I find advocates is we have built a Facebook group for the network. So just relying on those other foster, adoptive, and kinship parents and being able to communicate and reach out to them. But I also, as I mentioned, those partners that I've worked with, I'm part of a legislative action team for children and families, which looks at lots of issues related, not just child welfare or foster care. It looks at lots and lots of issues impacting families' health and budgets and poverty and all of that. But one of the things that they're able to do, because it's sort of a coalition of organizations, is they can send out action alerts, and their action alerts go to a couple thousand people. So if I need lots and lots of people to call legislators, I will have them do an action alert. So finding advocates, and what was the other part of that question? How do you make sure you're not reinventing the wheel?
Yep.
I think talking with your partners and kind of just, I like to do sort of environmental scans, which is kind of what that challenges and solutions document was, just to get a sense of what's happening, where are the gaps. The other thing that we did as an association this year was we conducted a big survey. We partnered with the state and the university, but that really gave us a basic sense of where the needs were, where were the gaps, where were people feeling like they had the support, and where did they not feel supported. And so then what were our things to advocate for based on that? And Mary, did you have things to add?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. I'd say, so again, if you're a parent and you're not connected with an organization and you have some things you want to change, the best thing I would say is to get connected with some organizations. And that can range from, so your parent, a local parent support group, a small one. I think you're starting with your foster adoptive parent associations, and many states have those. Some are more into advocacy than others, but there are always other parents there. Getting involved in the schools. If you start going to PTA and other things, you're going to run into other people, especially if you get involved in special education. You're probably likely to connect with other parents who have similar issues. So the best thing I can say is if you are not already connected, then get connected through parent support groups, and maybe even talk to your agency about, hey, I'd love to talk with other parents, and can you help, can you share my information to see if anybody else wants to get together and start a support group. And I'd say if you're looking for support groups or associations, feel free to email me at maryboo@nacac.org, and the information is at the end, and we will try to connect you with other advocates. So let me ask, so then we have a couple other questions. We have Nancy asked, if your group is a 501c3, what is the line that cannot be crossed in advocacy? And Marcia, you want me to answer that, or you want to do it?
I'll share a little bit and then I'll let you do the technicalities. So for me, it's always the line between educating and advocating, or advocating and lobbying, or educating and lobbying. Lobbying is telling a legislator how to vote on a specific piece of legislation or trying to influence the outcome of a specific piece of legislation, whereas educating can be, here's how these things are impacting families, or here's how this would impact a family. And Mary, I'll let you be more specific.
Sure. So I'll say the first thing is that non 501c3s, for people who don't know, that's nonprofits. Nonprofits are allowed to lobby. So they actually, the only line they can't cross, well, there are two lines they can't cross. One is sort of a bright line, one is a fuzzier line. The bright line is that you're not, with a 501c3, supposed to advocate, you're supposed to work for a political candidate. But in terms of lobbying to change legislation or rules, nonprofits can, and we think should, do that. You can't use a substantial portion of your funds to do it. So it has to be a minimal part of what you do. And if you're gonna, there's a great resource. And when Marissa's next talking, I'm gonna look it up if I can on my phone and get you a link. Otherwise, we'll put a link in the follow-up email. I think it's called the Alliance for Justice. It's a great group that does really good work on identifying the difference between lobbying and education, and really encourages nonprofits to lobby. And if you're going to do a lot of lobbying, you might want to do what's called the 501(h) election, which means you would actually report your lobbying expenses to the IRS, and it has very specific information about how much you can spend. But it's important to know, as Marissa said, you can do all the educating you want. It turns into lobbying if you're talking to members of Congress. If you say to them, please support this bill, or a bill, I want a bill that does this, or I want X amount of funding, that is lobbying. But again, lobbying's okay. And then it's grassroots lobbying if you say to your constituents, please call your member of Congress and tell them to take action. Again, and that's still okay, but there are limits on that as well. And again, we have can share more information, but the Alliance for Justice has some great resources on what those limits are. And we had one more.
One thing.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I add one more thing to that. Sorry. There are some funding sources that you really can't do any lobbying with. So you'll want to make sure that you have funding that is diversified, so that you have some funds that you can lobby with. But another way to kind of get around that, like that's where that legislative action team comes in really handy for me, because they can send alerts and then I'm not as worried about it. So there are you can sometimes have your partners help you with some of that too.
But yes, a really good point. If you are all state funded or all foundation funded, many foundations don't allow lobbying as part of their rules. And I think most, and then most, if you're all state funded, then yes, you'd have to be very careful, and you'd have to have volunteers doing the work. But even then, if you're doing any strategizing, you have to be careful. Then we had one other question, Marissa, which I think is a great one for you because you've done it. I'd love to talk to my agency about doing a survey or focus group, but worry I'm adding a bunch of work to their plate. How can we help with that?
Okay, so the way that ours actually came about was that I had asked the leadership of our state agency to meet with my members on a regular basis, quarterly, because they meet with lots of other people quarterly. And they decided that they wanted to do a survey to figure out how to structure a meeting and where to have it. They were thinking one meeting, not quarterly. And so when they asked me to help them do this survey. And when I went to meet with them, I said, sure, I'll help. I'd love to help you do a survey, but let's not do it about a meeting. And I brought with me a draft survey and that my members had written and said, here, we'd like to do this. And so they had kind of already opened the door to that. But I would say that there are ways that you can approach the state agency and show them the value of doing it. I mean, I wrote one of our members wrote the first draft of our survey, and then we kind of passed it around to all the child placing agencies in the state and lots of different partners to get feedback and craft the questions. And we were able to get a university to actually volunteer, which is kind of amazing, to help us with that. So that's how that came about, but you can certainly go to them and say, one really good example, Washington State does a survey every year. They have a university that actually does them by phone. So that's one example that I had given to the state. And when you start collecting it over time, even if it's every couple of years, then you can monitor trends and get a sense of how things are going and where to improve. So I think if you approach the state as, we really want to help strengthen services for foster parents, we need to get a sense of what people are doing. If you're able to get data about retention, that's a really good example. If we could improve services, then maybe we could retain people, and we can track this number over time to see if it goes up. If you don't have that, putting that in your survey is a good way to start to get that. Most of the work actually on our survey has been done by the university. So that has been more, and because they're not getting paid right now, I think that's been, it's taken some time and because we had a huge number of surveys turned in, it's taken some time to get it all analyzed. But I would sit down and talk with the state. I mean, we all know that we're always overworked, but making sure that we can reduce the workload if we can retain families, and if we can, even do better, whatever your goals are, do better, have more success in recruiting new families, or making sure that placements are more stable because families have more support, or kind of whatever your thinking is adding to their work. Does that help answer questions?
I thought it helped me, but and I'd say just one other thing is that, and Marissa, maybe I shouldn't volunteer this, but NACAC, we've done surveys more on adoptive families, but can be adapted. Adopt US Kids has a sample survey on support needs. Marissa has her survey. So one thing is to, if you do the help do the work of designing the survey, then the agency just has to get it out there. Um, so also, offering all the help you can, and again, copying from what others have done, I think is always the way to go when you can.
Yeah, and really all our agency did in terms of getting it out, they mailed it to everyone in their mailing list, but they also sent it to our child placing agencies to send out. And then I did the work of, I actually, through our network, contacted media outlets and asked them to run a story on it so that we could get to people who maybe weren't, adoptive parents who are disconnected from the system, informal kin, those kinds of folks. So, I mean, they did a press release too, but a lot of the kind of ground level work of getting it out there and drafting it and crafting it were done outside the agency or in partnership with them. So, and I'm happy to share my survey questions, although I still have to get them in a good format for doing that, but we're happy to share.
Yep.
All right, any other questions, Mary?
That looks like it for now. So I'll move on to the next section, and we'll have one more opportunity for questions toward the end. So if folks have them, hang on to them.
Okay, so when we start looking at, we've talked a lot about legislative advocacy, and a little bit about executive branch advocacy, but it can be helpful to kind of dive into those specific arenas. And there are some things that you do a little bit differently, especially when we're looking at the strategist and the advocate and the kind of those different roles. Obviously, we talked about activists earlier, but most of us, we didn't have anybody who said they felt like they were in that category. So we'll focus more on these two roles. But when doing legislative advocacy in particular, I'll spend a little more time on the advocate since that was most of our people, but the strategist is going to develop relationships with key players. So the leadership of the legislature, leadership of key committees, the staff of key legislators and committees. The staff tend to be there, especially like in our state. The attorneys for different committees are there far longer than any of the legislators because they're not elected. So having those relationships can be really key. They identify the allies and opponents. The strategist will kind of have a sense of who's working against or for this bill or this issue, monitor the progress and changes, engage the advocates at appropriate times and in strategic ways. So always kind of thinking about when do I need to do an alert. That came up this legislative session for me a lot was there were times where I wanted to do an alert, but I was like, I'm really not sure what the message is because the legislators had changed the bill so much that just thinking through like, what do I want people to call and say? What is the one, I can't give them 5 different points. I have to give them 1 or 2 things to say when they call. And I have to think about what is the most important thing, what should they be saying? So that, figuring that some of that kind of stuff out, and then coordinating those efforts with partners, advocates, and activists. The advocate in legislative advocacy is going to understand the legislative process. So understand what committees are and what they do and what it means that a bill is running in committee or that it's been assigned to a certain committee. Understand kind of the time frames. So our legislative session happens in between January and March. So trying to do legislative advocacy in August, we'll have a 2-day meeting with the legislature, but they don't vote on anything. So that's not as helpful. So understanding those kinds of things, studying the issues so that you know kind of what's important to you and what needs to be changed, finding the audience. And part of that is knowing, for example, that the legislature can't control the courts. So while they can pass laws, they can't tell a judge what they have to do. Or we ran into a lot of that this year with our bills of rights and things. Where some of the judicial people were saying, hey, that's legislative overreach. So we have different branches of government. So, kind of understanding, and not everything is a legislative fix. Some things are better done by the executive branch or by talking to the judiciary. Plan for the interaction as an advocate. If you're going to go meet with legislators, you want to make an appointment, schedule a time to sit down with them or their staff, have a sense of plan out your story, what you're going to talk about, your issues, maybe bring a handout. If you have time, do some research on who you're meeting with so that you kind of know what their approach is. Or, for example, if they have experience as a foster or adoptive or kinship parent, we have 2 or 3 legislators who've been foster parents, some who have taken the training but didn't do it, some who have family members, children or grandchildren who are foster parents. So knowing that connection can be really important. And then always follow up. So send a thank you. If someone asks you a question in a meeting that you don't know the answer to, never make it up. It's fine to say, I'll get back to you on that, or let me double check, or let me find some resources, and then make sure that you do that, follow up on that. And then looking at executive branch advocacy in that arena, so your state agency or county agencies. The strategist, again, is going to build relationships with those key people. And you'll see that in the next slide too. Relationships are so important to all of this process, because you can get in touch with people more easily. You can, they will often come to you. I have legislators who come to me on a pretty regular basis asking me questions about things, or how a bill, and some of them would even raise a bill with me and say, have you seen this bill? How does this impact? And sometimes I haven't seen it yet. Study the agency policies and your issues. So while laws impact, or what the legislature works on, the state agency works on policies. So study their policies or their rules, and know if there are things that are not being interpreted right or applied the way that they appear to be written. Know if there are things that you think need to be changed. Learn the opportunities for involvement. So as a strategist, you want to know, are there boards, are there committees, are there work groups? Is there a parent advisory board? Is there a citizen review board? Is there, are there some other committees that your advocates or you can be part of? And then involve the advocates in that process as well. And then as an advocate, you'll want to know those policies and understand how they intersect with your issues. Hone your personal story, and this is important for doing legislative advocacy too. We all have a personal story, and Mary will talk more about this, but sometimes we want to tell every detail. So figuring out how to get that down into the really important points, having a couple different versions, so you have a long version, a short version, and honing that down for sharing, and then be willing to serve on those boards and committees and work groups that are available, so that you are able to have your voice heard and kind of represent the voice of other parents as well. And then working with the media, which is a sort of an area of advocacy we haven't talked a whole lot about. I mentioned it with the survey, but it can also be important when doing either executive branch or legislative advocacy. So as a strategist, again, you're going to develop relationships with the media. One of the things we're seeing right now in the COVID scenarios, that our governor is doing daily press conferences. And usually the most important part of those press conferences is when the media starts asking questions. And so one of the things that I do a lot is ask my members, do you have concerns? Do you have questions? Are there issues you're facing that we need to get an answer to? And if I can't get an answer in other ways, I will sometimes text to someone in the media and say, hey, could you ask this question today at the press conference? I mean, I'll try all my other avenues first, but if I can't get an answer or we're not getting anywhere, then that's sometimes a good way to, or a way to just highlight an issue. So having those relationships can be really important. A strategist will write press conference or press advisories and press releases. So if you're having a press conference or an event that you want the media at, or you have a story you want them to publish, they study the issue and often are seen as an expert. So because they've built all those relationships, when somebody has a question about child welfare or about whatever issue you're being a strategist on, the media, the legislature, the executive branch will often come to the strategist and say, we need an opinion, or we need advocates to do something. And then they'll write op-eds and letters. And the advocate is willing and ready to be interviewed. So again, this is part of honing that story. Working with the strategist, or other people, if you feel like you need some tips on talking to the media. One of the really important things for a strategist is that they are never the only voice out there. They can't be. It's not effective advocacy if they are the only voice that's being heard, or the only person who's talking to the media or in the news. So it's important to make sure that you have other advocates who are able to do interviews and talk to the media, so that it's clear that it's not just one person asking for something. This is a lot of people, and it's going to impact a lot of people. Advocates study their issues. Know this, again, Mary talked about that. Know the statistics and trends. Hone your personal story, and then learn to write op-eds as well. And under strategists, you see it says write op-eds with others. Something I didn't even know when I started this that you really could do is have multiple authors on an op-ed, and often that makes it a stronger message. And it brings other people into the work and helps advocates feel like they're getting to have a voice too.
Great. I'll just
So,
add one thing about the op-eds. And again, if you have found a legislative champion, um, and can write an op-ed with them, it's much more likely to be placed. And so, if you have somebody who really cares about your issue, that's kind of a great way to bring these things together. So you're bringing that relationship to bear on getting media exposure. Because again, we can all submit op-eds, and again, you might get them in, especially if you submit to sort of smaller papers or more local papers, harder to get into the Washington Post or the New York Times. But if you are, co-writing it with somebody who's a member of your state legislator or somebody else who has some power or some perceived power, it can be a great way to do great partnership for media exposure.
yeah. Also, partnering with youth is another great way to get op-ed to do op-eds so that their voice is part of that process as well.
Yep.
So parent and youth writing together, or parent, youth, and a legislator or someone else can be a really powerful team to do that. And then I will hand it off to Mary to talk about sharing your story.
Okay, thank you. And we've touched a lot on sort of the power of the personal story, and how advocates, one of the, Marissa described them as the army, and to keep that metaphor going, one of the weapons that they have, and one of the weapons you have as a parent, is your personal story. And stories are what inspire change. That's what make issues real to policymakers and administrators and other decision makers. It's what they're going to remember when a bill comes up. They're going to say, "Oh, yep, I heard this story once." So what you are doing is giving them the passion or the reason to become an advocate for a bill and a champion. And we know many instances where one constituent's told story and law's been changed. And again, that change isn't always good. Sometimes making a decision based on one story is not a great one. But again, what we're talking about is really looking at stories that pair with the data that backs up what you have to say. And so again, the individual story gets them to care, it gets them to remember, but the data shows how broad the impact of an action will be or how big the need is. So, for example, if you have a story about how support has helped lessen your child's struggles with trauma related behaviors, that might touch their heart. But if you can then talk about how 2,000 other foster parents in your state have had similar experiences, but only a few hundred get the support they need because there's not enough funding for peer support, well, then that's the data that makes them realize it's much bigger than just your story. So you want to, when you're thinking about your story or others' stories, you want to go back to your goals. I mean, you've already talked about what your ask is and what your recommendations. You have to think about the messages or stories that best relate to those goals. So, if you're working on foster parents having a role in decision making, your talking points might include foster parents spend the most time with the children and they know them better than most, and not including their birth parents, obviously, and birth family members, but in terms of those, in working with them. We learn best from those with lived experience. They know today's reality on the ground. And if we want what's best for kids, we need to listen to those who are caring for them. So those might be kind of your background, your messages you want to get across. So you have to come up with stories that fit that. And I'll give an example. It's sort of a simple example, but I think very powerful about foster parents who have information, the importance of making sure that foster parents have information. And we talked about that as an advocacy goal. You want to make sure that caseworkers know how important it is to share information. We were talking to a foster parent recently who had a placement of a teenager, and within a day of being placed in their home, she attempted suicide by throwing herself down the stairs. And it turns out that folks who placed her knew she was suicidal and never shared that information. And I can't tell you you can almost feel it. Again, and I'm not the person who had this experience, but when he told his story, and he told it very briefly, not much longer than what I just said, but anybody could say, "Oh my gosh, goodness, look at what a difference it makes if we're not sharing information or not providing support." So you want to think about those stories that get at the messages. So if that your message is we need to make sure that foster parents have information about the kids in their care, a story like that brings it home really powerfully. Um, so then once you have those messages, you need to think about who your storytellers might be. So if you're the strategist or the people who are kind of planning this, you're not just a parent alone. And we'll talk a little bit about if you're a parent alone, what you do with your story. But you want to brainstorm. Not every story fits. Like what may have happened in your family may not be the best story to talk to somebody. So you kind of want to talk through the types of families. So if you were talking about the other example that was on the last slide, you're talking about the need for support services for older children. Well, you're going to want families who had a child with maybe a specific disability, and you probably want a mix of stories. You might want some families who got support and their child is doing better, and another family who wasn't able to access that support and is still struggling. And again, if you can have a young person, as Marissa said when talking about the media, the same is true in your advocacy. One of the most powerful advocates I worked with was a young woman named Paula from Colorado, and she was someone who ran away. She was hospitalized. She was put into residential treatment, and she talked about what a difference it made once somebody understood that what she was doing was because of the trauma she'd experienced, and she got the support she needed to deal with her past trauma, and is now incredibly successful. And but she was able to articulate that in a way that no one else could. So you want to think about the people who've had those experiences and how they fit in. So again, having her talk about that support, it was life altering. And then she went from someone who was in a, who was hospitalized to somebody who is now a social worker and doing wonderfully. So you want to, again, solicit stories that might fill those needs. So you want to think, hey, has anybody had a great experience? Their kids are doing better because of the support they received, or you were involved in decision making and you were able to make a difference that helped you get a kid reunified safely. So you want to kind of go through talking to the other people in your support group, in your circle, about their experiences to see what fits. You always want to, if you can, find people who are constituents, whoever the policymakers you're seeking to influence is a great, you want to do that. And even if that constituent doesn't have a story that fits, if that you can pair them with somebody whose story does, and they can go in and say, I'm a foster parent and this is so important to me. And my friend here is going to tell a story that'll paint the picture. So you can really, um, bring things together. So, and you want to think about, if you're working alone, you want to think about the experiences you've had that fit with your messages, and not everything will fit. So you want to kind of bring that critical eye to your own story as well. And so to talk about this, I want to talk about. So this is when you're telling your story. And Marissa said, we want to come up with a couple of varieties of your story, and I think that is absolutely true. You want to. I would start with, I'd say, almost the briefest version. You want to think with keeping it as simple as possible. You often don't have a lot of time, and usually in our own stories, I always compare it perhaps inaccurately, but like when I have a weird dream and I want to tell somebody about my dream, I can get really into the details and they don't care. Like it doesn't get interesting, it doesn't get more powerful, but they may be interested in that I had a dream that I flew on a dragon to my boss's office and then got in trouble, but they don't care about what we flew over and everything else. So you want to kind of distill it down to the most simple story you can, and then you can add details depending on your audience. Now if you have an audience that really understands trauma or understands foster care issues, you might get more detailed. You might get back to, we talked about my example earlier of the red book, you might talk about that particular book and how it affects having the information about your kid, whereas you might in an audience that knows less, you might just say, what, it can be critically important if you don't have information. My the daughter I was caring for almost killed herself because no one told me to watch out for that. um, so I think the couple things I want to say is that you always want to protect your children and yourself first. So strategic sharing. You don't want to tell everything. If your child is old enough and developmentally appropriate, you might ask if their permission to tell their story, and find ways that they are comfortable telling it. If you have, you might not want to use their name or other information that someone would know if you have a couple of kids, which child they're talking about. This is particularly important, of course, if you're talking about the media. We know things live on forever, and once something's online, it's there. And so you want to think very carefully. You can even, tell the story as if it's someone else's. And I don't mean to lie, but you could say, a foster parent I know went through this, or a foster parent experienced X. And so you're not saying it's somebody other than you, but you're not also revealing it to be your child or yourself if that's not the right decision for your family. You want to, in your tell story, you want to talk about your children as individuals with strengths as well as challenges. We're talking often about the need for support, and we know that there's a huge impact of trauma and loss. Um, but it's really important to make sure that people connect with our kids as a wonderful member of the family, a loved, cared for member of the family, as well as someone who struggles. So you want them not to think about this child as a diagnosis or a problem, but as somebody that you love and you care about who is really struggling because of what has happened to them or because of their mental health. Um, and you want to respect others in your storytelling. If there is a social worker who you think did bad practice, you might want to talk about it in terms of, you certainly wouldn't want to name that person in most of your advocacy. If there's a real problem, if you're that's an individual level advocacy, if you need to go to a supervisor. But if you're trying to make system change, it's not about this particular worker, it's about the system that didn't prevent bad practice. And so you just want to be careful. The more negative you are, the less likely people are going to want to be involved in what you do, and to see, this as a solution that you can work on together. If they feel like you're just bashing someone or being negative, we all want to be part of things that are successful. And um, excuse me, that you feel hope. So I say that's what I'm segue into that, like, as I said, the last slide here, leave them with a possible solution. You want to make sure people feel that the system has value, and there's a reason that this advocacy is going to happen. If the system is so broken and so horrible, why would anyone invest more money in it or invest their time and attention? If it's all so bad, why are you doing it? You have to give people hope that there's a solution in your stories. So, I want to give one example of a story that I thought was incredibly simple and incredibly powerful. I was with foster adoptive parent testifying before the legislature, and we were talking about investing in support services, including peer support. And she told a story of her first placement many years ago, where she had a child who was crying a lot, and all of her friends who were not foster adoptive parents said, "Oh, just put him in the crib and let him cry it out." And he was getting worse and worse. And finally, another foster parent said, "Well, maybe he was abandoned in a crib, and so this is triggering him." She felt horrible, um, and stopped doing it that way, and he was much better in very short order. Well, that's something she had to learn from people with that lived experience, that knew, oh my goodness, this child, even he certainly was too young to articulate it, thought maybe she was not going to come back for him. And that story, I mean, most of the people that we were talking to, can picture the kid crying and have heard everybody talk about cry it out, and, the debates about whether that's right for any child, but it particularly was not right for this child who'd had an experience. And her story took about 2 minutes, and you could see people get the power of peer support as a result of it. So again, keep it simple and give people hope that this is going to make a difference.
Hey, Mary, can I jump in with a quick example of a story?
Of course. Yes.
A story that had to be very short. So the last day of our no, not quite the last day, toward the end of the session, when the Senate was going to be voting on our bill, there had been a lot of funding put into the bill, and then the Senate had taken it out, and we were trying to get it put back in, and it was this big deal, and they'd come to an agreement, and part of the funding was for this rate increase. And we had a grandmother who had her 5 grandchildren that she was raising on not the full monthly amount, but because there had been hangups in getting her certified. She drove 3 hours with another advocate the night before the bill was going to be on the agenda at like 11 o'clock the next day to be here at the Capitol that morning. But in order for that to be effective, we had to make sure that she met as many legislators as she could before they voted, as many senators. So we camped out outside the Senate, and we made the rounds, and we literally had just a couple minutes with each person to say, this is a grandmother who is raising her kids on this much, and she's, this could impact, when you vote on this bill, this is who you're impacting. And it was able to give them a face, and to have her there in person was really important for them to see her when they were voting. So, but because it was very, very short time before they were going to vote, we had to really make it quick. We didn't have time to go into details about the kids or about the needs or any of that kind of stuff, but to make sure that we were connecting with as many people and getting just that basic story. When you vote, this is who you're impacting. This is an example of the people that you're impacting. And that was really powerful. And I think really kind of helped push it over the edge. So, and we were able to get her certified and get that taken care of. So that helped too.
And I think I'll just add one thing to that. When you're talking about funding for caregivers, if you in those 2 minutes can talk about, with this funding, I can help my child access therapy where there's copays and other things I can't pay for. I can get tutoring to help them catch up on school. You want to make it real to people. It's not, again, this is, I think, particularly important if you're talking about funding, just to have a couple examples of what are some of the things that having those resources can do to help your child. We talk about reasonable and prudent parenting. Well, I want my kids involved in sports, but I can't afford it. So again, I think it's really good to have those examples. And it's been, if you have a young person advocating that can help, they can be really good at that piece too, what they aren't able to do.
That's a really good point. And that was one of the things we were able to say was, like, she was still driving them to school in the next county over because she wanted them to stay part of their home school. And so, or their, original school. So that cost and, some of those things that she wanted to be able to do to help them we were able to share a little bit of that.
That's great. So, all right. Now I'm going to turn it back to you, Marissa.
Oh, okay. So some places to collect data and do some of the research that you might need to do. The Children's Bureau Child Welfare Outcomes Reports. There are links here for all of these, but there are some data is really pretty readily available. Others you may have to request from your state agency or county agency, and some isn't available, and that's why we need surveys and things. But the child trends data on adoption, foster care, and kinship care for your state can be found online. You can certainly look up your members of Congress so that you can call them and your state legislators. I share that Common Cause link with members quite regularly so that they can identify who their legislators are and contact them specifically. So those are some good sources. And then a couple of tools, the challenges and solutions document that I mentioned, Mary put that up on the NACAC website, so you can go to that link and see it just to get an example of how we laid it out. And then I didn't talk about it earlier, but one tool that I used a lot during legislative session, writing fact sheets is something that you often have to do when you're doing legislative advocacy, just to give legislators something they can look at, something they can read and reference. And for me, it was really hard to do that without making it 10 pages because I felt like they don't know that much about child welfare and I have to give them all the information. Okay, not really 10 pages, but even a full page or two was way more information. Some of them who I had a good relationship with gave me feedback and said, this is too much because we get thousands of these. We get so many of these. I need you to pick like the top 3 things. And so the way that I did that a lot was through infographics. So there's a few websites there where you can make free infographics. That always felt a little overwhelming to me. Like, I'm not a graphic designer. I don't know how to make this, but those websites helped a lot and really helped me distill it down to kind of a graphic visual. Here are the things that I need you to know about this issue or this bill or the impact of this. And then always the NACAC website, there's a great whole section on the NACAC website about how to advocate, and some of what we talked about and some other tips and tools are on there as well. And as Mary mentioned, finding support groups and your state agency and other groups. The NACAC website is great for that. If you're not able to find them, certainly reach out to Mary. You can reach out to me too, and I'll probably reach out to them or send you them. But they're really great about knowing who's in which state and can help you connect with them, with people to help. So any questions?
I know one person asked for the Fostering Champs website. Again, I did send it. It's fosteringchamps.org, but I did send that in the chat. And we will, after the session, we will send you this recording, which will have a link to the challenges and solutions, and the recording will be on the NACAC website with the slides, so if people are looking for those resources. But if anybody has any other questions, we have a couple minutes. Anything we didn't cover, we should have? We both get a little bit excited, and sometimes I don't know. There's so much to say about advocacy, and again, it's great to hear what Marissa's doing day by day. That you had an amazing session this year with so much success. I think, I know, even though it wasn't always it wasn't easy.
But it was not easy. It was a lot of late nights, but it was well worth it.
Yeah.
Of course, now we have the fun of implementing, which that's the other piece I guess I'll mention about advocacy is that once you get the bill passed or the policy set or the whatever, that doesn't mean your job's over. There's still all of the monitoring how it's implemented and making sure that parent voice is included in that process and that it's implemented well and appropriately, and then tweaking it for, looking at, oh, well, this didn't quite end up being interpreted the way we thought that it would. One time when I was working with the deaf community, we got a bill passed that was supposed to change how who could be licensed to teach sign language in schools. And the Department of Ed did not interpret the bill the way that the legislature did and the way that the rest of us did. So it did not get implemented the way we thought it would. And so we had to go back to the drawing board. And no policy or law or new program is ever perfect. So there's always tweaking and going back and saying, okay, well, we thought we fixed this, but we didn't. So let's change this, or let's create a new thing that we didn't expect. So now we need to fix that.
Yeah, there are unintended consequences. And I think that's it's a great advocacy lesson to go. You can go back to your legislators and say, oh my God, this is amazing. We did this thing, but we've just figured this out. And if they were invested the first time, they're often invested in getting it right. And it's one of the things you can even build into, if you're working on a big bill, you might want to build in some oversight or build in a task force that's going to look at it in a year, or that there has to be a report on it. There are ways to sort of build in some of that implementation review or oversight in your initial asks. They're often willing to let things like that stay in there. Or build in evaluation, so if you're trying to fund a new program, make sure that it says and will be evaluated. So you can have some of that ammunition that you need to say, look, this is really making a difference, or oops, it's not yet. We need to make some more changes.
And if your legislators have been really engaged in passing the law, then as those reports come, like ours are usually reported back to the legislature, they'll be engaged in saying, oh, well, maybe we need to fix this, or how come you're not implementing that the way we thought you would? So keeping that, that level of engagement can also be helpful. And in our state, our legislature meets for 2 days every month in between sessions. They don't vote, but they get those reports and they hear from people. And so I often will go to those meetings, and I have a bunch of legislators in my phone that I have their cell phone numbers. So I'll text them questions that I think they should ask, or questions that, if they're asking a question and they aren't seeming to get the answer, sometimes I'll text that. So having those relationships can be helpful for that kind of thing too.
Great. All right. Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions, so we are close to the end. So I think we can just wrap it up. But I'm going to go. The next slide has our contact information. So again, feel free to reach out to us if you have specific questions or if there's anything we can do. We are both happy to help, and we again are really committed to the idea of that we're all in this together, and we learn from others. And if you're working on an issue, we might be able to figure out who has succeeded at that issue. And so, just let us know, and we will do the best we can to get your answers.
Thank you so much for being here, everybody, and stay safe and let us know if you have any questions.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Marissa. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Mary.
Bye.